Start recording. Start feeling incredibly embarrassed. Activate. All right, hello and welcome to Office Hours here for Game Dev Coaching. This is the March 6th edition, or as one would say in any other part of the world except the States, where date is tracked in a reasonable way, 6th March. I'm your host, Keith Fuller. For any of you who accidentally stumbled upon this stream looking for the Menudo concert, this is where I take some time to answer any people questions that people might have about the games industry. How do I do a thing? How do I not do a thing? So what I will be doing for the next umpteen minutes is diving into the mailbag. So we've got some questions here, and because it's the wonders of the internet, you will never actually know if these are coming from real humans, ChatGPT, or if I made them up myself. That's right, there could be chicanery afoot. All right, well, let's get going here. I don't want to waste your time or mine. Let's look at the first question we've got here. Okay. What on earth makes you qualified to hand out advice to anybody, you giant fraud? Hugs and kisses, your crippling self-doubt. Well, self-doubt, thanks for coming. And I'll start off by saying you raise an excellent point. As soon as I was introduced to the idea of imposter syndrome years ago, I thought, they made this syndrome up just to describe me. How thoughtful. Because really, I was a game dev lead for several years. Okay, so that was a thing. But following that, I've been doing consulting for, 13-ish years now. And it's not as though you can go to a school where they teach you, here's how to know everything about leadership. Yes, there are executive training programs, and there are certainly there's coaching institutes where you can learn to be a certified coach. These things exist. But in terms of, especially this industry, how do you know what's a good practice from a bad practice? How do you evaluate a situation or the way someone's handling a problem and suggest how to do it differently? Well, there are a few different sources that I draw from for this purpose. And the first is many years of bad examples. Having been at points in time in the past a full-time employee in the games industry, I have numerous bad examples to draw from. So for instance, when I joined Raven Software, this was beginning of 1999. The company had just recently been acquired by Activision. And I seem to recall this was the first external studio that Activision had purchased. And of course, now they own, scads of them. They've closed several of them, even. They've had so many. But I believe Raven was the first. So what that meant was there were a lot of growing pains. These came from the Raven side, they came from the Activision side, because nobody really knew how to handle this relationship yet. Some of those growing pains came from a comparatively large, comparatively corporate organization, Activision, trying to instill a sense of order and process into various nooks and crannies of this game studio. So a classic example of that, performance reviews. So at corporate giant Activision, performance reviews were a once-a-year monolithic process that involved pages of documentation, questions that were largely irrelevant to game developers, probably largely irrelevant to everybody at the company, but they sounded good on paper to somebody at some point. So they're included in the process. And this whole endeavor gave me a basket full of information that I can draw from when people say, for instance, hey, how can you help us do performance reviews well? Because I can basically say, well, here are all of the things that we did when we first joined Activision, and I would suggest, for starters, doing the opposite of all of them. I'm sure things have gotten better since. That was many, many years ago. But as an example of the trove of bad examples that I have to draw from, there you go. So that's one source, bad examples. I'll draw from those happily. There's also the fact that once I decided, okay, I want to help game companies be run better. I want them to treat developers better. I want to see devs fulfilled at work instead of burned out like I was. So once I decided that, I took to whatever forms of social media were available, and in the early 2010s, basically, it wasn't much compared to today. Twitter was a different landscape back then. Bit of a Wild West, not the same flavor of dumpster fire that it is today. And I happily looked around for everybody I could find in the games industry who said something that sounded remotely sensible, that sounded remotely geared towards treating people better, having a healthier workplace, seeing people not participate in mandatory unpaid overtime to get a build out the door. So anytime I saw somebody with a blog post, Facebook post, something on Twitter, anything that sounded like it was in the right direction, I would follow them, and then I would look to see who they followed. And so from this approach, I gathered up this collection of folks that seemed to be doing the best things, as far as I could find, across the industry, and started learning from them. So I picked up lots of tips and tricks thusly. So what on earth makes you qualified to hand out advice? Well, lots of bad examples from my time as a developer. As many good examples as I could possibly find from seeing folks elsewhere in the industry. And then I also went down the classic route of going to the library and looking up every well-known leadership tome that one could get one's hands on. And also looking at anybody who would be suggesting good books online. So if they're folks that I was following because they seemed to know something about treating people well, if one of those people recommended a book, I put it on the list. So I would read as many books as I could get my hands on as well. Some of them, it's classic management literature. And so you're looking at like Jack Welch kind of stuff from GE and basically things that really fall into the category of this is a good, bad example, never do this. Like the man who invented stack ranking, Neutron Jack. Maybe we don't say, here's someone I should emulate. But there are other authors that more recently have created some fabulous books that I draw from regularly and frequently. Folks like Kim Scott, Radical Candor, Just Work. Dan Pink, books like Drive. Many others too numerous to name. If you're interested, I actually have a Google folder of, this isn't up to date, but I used to keep good track of book reports. I would write several pages of notes, things that I thought were noteworthy from the leadership books that I would read, things on culture and what have you. So if anybody sends me an email or what have you, say, hey, Keith, sounds like maybe, you have a history of books that would be valuable to me as a people leader or what have you, then great. You ask me, I will share that with you. Knock yourself out. So there we go. Several sources that I draw from. And then also, I think that was like 3 sources thus far, maybe. The 4th source would be, well, I have been at this a while. Talked to a lot of companies. I've worked with a bunch of teams at big companies and small ones here in the States, elsewhere around the world, and everybody has something that they do, something they've come up with that's specific to them, how they handle scenarios, that is a step in the right direction that's better than something else that I've seen elsewhere. So you just kind of keep your eyes open and you go, wow, that person said something really great. I'm absolutely using this. Give you an example. This is maybe not the deepest thing you'll hear me ever say, but I still think it's phenomenal. Was on a coaching call with a client last week, maybe. And we were talking about the subject of having lived through bad examples and being able to draw from those to send people in a better direction in the future. And the person I was coaching said this, and I told him, you know what, I'm absolutely stealing this because it's phenomenal. As we were saying that, yeah, we're both kind of going through all of our bad examples and figuring out how to do better because of them, he said, yep, we're just composting trauma. We are just taking all of the bad stuff that we've been through and figuring out how to turn that into fertilizer so something better can grow. And I said, that's absolutely golden. I am taking composting trauma. So that's an example of the fourth source of material that I use for figuring out how to tell people maybe a better way to do things, how to suggest a better process, some better practices for them. All right, so that's one question out of the way. Thank you, Crippling Self-Doubt, for that submission. Let's look at what's this next one I wrote down. Okay. I think there's a good chance that this next question has befallen almost everybody who's ever told someone, yeah, I work in the games industry in any capacity. Like, I don't care how long you've been in games, what company, what discipline you're in. At some point in time, you've probably been asked, how do I get a job in games? Right? It's on a Reddit thread. It's in a forum post somewhere. It's somebody that you meet elsewhere, friends, family, whatever. Once they find out you're in the super cool video games industry, then somebody will ask you, how do I get a job in games? Okay. This question has taken on different meaning through the years. And I used to give different answers than I would give today. One of the first things that would probably come out of my mouth were somebody to ask me this now in the first quarter of 2024. I would probably respond with, why on earth do you want to get into the games industry? I mean, in general, you should understand your why. So that's always been a good response. But specifically in the year of our Lord 2024, have you been, and if they're not in the games industry, maybe they haven't been watching the news. But if you have been watching the news in the games industry, wow. Everywhere you turn, it's layoffs, it's hiring freezes, it's studio closures, all of this dire stuff. You know, for a 180 billion a year industry or whatever we're supposed to be up to now, nobody knows where the billions are. Nobody. Everywhere you turn, it's like, well, we're running out of contracts. We haven't had a gig in months. We've had to let people go. Everybody, it's terrible. So yeah, why would you want to be in the games industry? But let's get past that and assume that this person has good reasoning and they're dedicated to this concept of getting a job in games. All right. So what I would probably do there is I would say, you know what, listen, there's schooling that you could attempt, although when you just look at the numbers of universities that have games related or games adjacent curricula, and they are turning out how many graduates a year, look at that number and then compare that to how many openings there are in the games industry. One number is probably significantly bigger than the other. So how are you even going to, with your freshly printed diploma from an accredited university, how are you even going to get a job in games? Even with that, I don't know. So that's the schooling end of things. But then the other end of things, this is the one that I've always suggested is more valuable anyway, is have you ever made a game? And that sounds like, well, holy crap, that's a lot. Like I'm an art major or whatever. But my contention is this. Whatever discipline you would hope to be going into, there is something in games or games adjacent that you can do on your own to demonstrate expertise, skill, knowledge, something that's probably more meaningful to a game company than a diploma. A diploma shows something. It shows you can finish something that you started. So it shows that you care and you have a level of tenacity. But being able to hand somebody a demo, hey, here's a link, download this, play this thing. It's on itch.io, it's wherever it is. I did X on this game, if not the whole thing, some part of it. Okay. So that's probably more meaningful in this day and age. I won't say definitely more, but probably more meaningful in a number of places, in a number of game companies, than having a diploma with nothing playable to show for it, right? So that's kind of a discussion for another time, but that's what I have said traditionally, is to kind of look at these avenues. Okay. What I would say is more important and closer to my own domain is, let's imagine that either your diploma or that link that you shared with somebody or some combination thereof got you an interview. Okay. So what to do in an interview is more up my alley. So I'll start there. And I will say that there's a lot of preparation that you can do that's kind of standard practice. You can find any number of TikToks or articles out there, whatever, about how to answer this kind of tough question or that in an interview. Okay. My suggestion with this is going to be similar to just about any people interaction skill that I suggest, which is arguably the most meaningful preparation you can do is role playing. Practice with somebody. Have somebody sit across from you and ask you interview questions. That's one of the best ways to train, to figure out how to make words come out of your mouth in response to a particular question. It's the best way to do it. You're going to fight like you train. Okay. So you can start there after you're done watching all the TikToks. And I will tell you that you'll probably hear things like you want to respond to questions with the STAR method. Okay, so you can look that up, STAR. It's situation. It's this abbreviation. You can look that up. That's a way to prepare. Like, somebody is going to ask you, this is a classic question, right? Tell me about a time when, and then they'll insert something that, tell me about a time you had to respond to a last minute request. Tell me about a time you had to work with a difficult coworker. Tell me about a time you had to hit a deadline. All these kinds of things. Okay, so there's a format for how to intelligently answer some of those things. So you prepare some of these. But what I would consider to be something that will make you stand out, and it's unfortunate that you never get enough time to do this and it's at the end of the interview, okay? But something that will make you stand out is having good questions prepared to ask in advance. The number of times that I have performed an interview, like I'm working with a client, a company, in people operations, helping them hire people, helping them interview. And the number of times that I've asked the candidate, okay, well, so we've got, 10 minutes left or whatever what questions do you have for us? The number of times they've said, you know what? I think you've pretty much answered everything I came in with. Or worse yet, no, I really don't have any questions. Like they didn't plan to ask any. This should never be you. When you get your interview opportunity, you need to have questions ready to ask. Like you have memorized so many of these, or you bring a notebook with some of these questions written down. You're prepared, right? And there's no way that in the course of a 30-minute, 60-minute interview, they're going to just tell you all of the things, all of the answers to all of your questions, because you're going to have so many of these important questions prepared in advance. By the way, I have a document of exactly some of these questions because somebody put this to me years ago. Well, then, if I'm supposed to have questions, what do I ask? So I put in like a page and a half of them into a Google Doc, and I've been sharing them publicly for years. They're probably mostly still valid. So let me know if you want access to that. Happy to share that link. But you come with questions and meaningful questions, not like, if you're talking to the person who would potentially be your boss, let's say, tell me, what's your leadership style? Like, no, that's too softball. It's too meaningless. It's not going to give you important information. I would even go so far as to suggest asking questions that are likely to make the interviewer uncomfortable. Because on the interviewing side of the table, it's often, honestly, people who are underprepared. They have received little to no skills training to be an interviewer. And a lot of folks just kind of go on gut feel or what have you. They just aren't really prepared. I think that's a deficiency in the organization, which should tell you something about whether or not you want to work there. But it's worth pointing those things out so that, hey, maybe that's going to drive this organization to do a better job of preparing its interviewers in the future. So I would consider asking questions like, for starters, is this a new position or are you backfilling a position? So backfilling means they used to have somebody in this role, they left for one reason or another. Okay, so is this a new role that you've opened up or are you backfilling for someone? And the immediate follow-up there is, why did the last person leave? And that sounds like a super simple thing to ask, but what if that's because the person was fired for cause? Meaning they were like embezzling or whatever. Like that's a good thing to know, but a company probably doesn't want to share something like that. What if the actual answer that the person gave when they left this role was, during their exit interview, they said, you know what, you're paying me so little and I've been so badly mistreated by my manager, I'm absolutely going to take a pay cut to work someplace else. What if that's why the person left? Is the company going to tell you? So having some of these potentially uncomfortable questions ready, and that's important to you, right? Like you would want to know if you are filling a position that was left by somebody who was mistreated. You would want to know that because you would then want to say, okay, thank you for your time, and decline any further offers from that company because you don't want to throw yourself into a meat grinder that somebody else just climbed out of. So be prepared to have some questions to ask is kind of a thing that I would say sets you apart. I will add the flip side of this because I kind of just got done ranting about, okay, but a lot of interviewers are not prepared frequently. Okay, so that's a failure on the part of the organization to throw people into, and I was one of those interviewers, by the way. The first time I was ever asked to participate as an interviewer when I worked at Raven, I was literally walking down the hall to go do something else. And someone said, hey, Keith, you got a minute? We need some help with an interview. And I was so young and inexperienced. I was like, sure, okay. And just walked into a conference room. And now I'm interviewing somebody. I didn't know their name, the project they were going to be on, the role they were interviewing for, hadn't seen their resume, didn't know anything about them. No training, no education whatsoever. Okay, so we don't want that to happen at your company, right? Okay, how can we do a better job of interviewing candidates? Well, let's go over some basics here. And I'll start with the concept of evaluation versus filtering. So evaluate versus filter a candidate. You want to, the problem we're here to solve with interviewing is we've identified a business need that will be filled by putting a human in a position here at the company. Okay, so what we're trying to do is, as quickly as possible, for as little money as possible, fill this business need. That's the goal. And, there are competing things that you have to balance there. Well, we want quickly, but that doesn't mean we're just going to extend an offer to the first candidate that comes in the door, right? We want the best candidate, but that doesn't mean we're going to take 10 years to sift through 1,000 candidates to pick the best one, right? So we have these competing things of speed versus quality here. But the concept of filtering is this. There are criteria that a person just flat out won't meet. Like if we are one of the companies that says we're demanding people return to office and you have to have a physical presence in the workplace 5 days a week. Okay, if that is a absolutely unbending requirement for this role, and the candidate has to be remote because they are caring for a dying loved one, or because they have they're immunocompromised and can't be in a workplace with others, like whatever, then they know in advance, okay, this place requires me to be on site. I need a remote job. I won't even apply. So we want that filtering to occur. And for the company's sake, we want the candidates to be able to self-filter as much as possible. If, for instance, candidates, they're supporting a family, they have to have a job that pays at least $100,000 US a year. If they knew that there was no way this particular job is ever going to pay $100,000 a year, then they shouldn't even apply, because it flat out won't meet their needs. Right? So that's information that we want to provide so that people can self-filter out of the process. Evaluation occurs once we've dealt with the filters, and as much as we are reasonably able, we have determined that this person is available, they'll work for the money that we can offer, they're going to meet any other requirements we have about being on site, or these sorts of things. Okay. Now we evaluate the candidates that have passed the filters. Is this one better than that one? That's incredibly difficult, and it's a whole art/science unto itself. But that's what we want to do in addition to the filtering. So we filter and then we're evaluating. Okay, so we've got those concepts. When we are evaluating someone, this is the various stages of the interview process. There are, with the sorts of questions that we ask, the foundational one is, at least here in the States, do you know how to not get sued? Do you know how to ask legal questions as opposed to unlawful questions, things you can't ask that are blatantly discriminatory? For instance, you cannot ask a candidate, do you have kids? You plan on getting pregnant? Right? Like, those are things that you can't do because pregnancy is a protected class. You can't hire or not hire based on whether they're pregnant or might become pregnant. That's not a thing you can do legally. If you try doing that with a candidate, if they know their stuff, they will just go out and get an employment lawyer, show them the emails and everything that you've done to discriminate against them, and then they'll sue your company and they will win, right? So we don't want any of that. So first of all, do you know how to ask questions that are not unlawful? Hopefully you have trained your interviewers to know what these categories of questions are. Once we get past that, I tell people, listen, there are three buckets of questions, three lines of questions, three areas that we're interested in. The first is values alignment. So in the past, this has been termed culture fit. That phrase has really been weaponized in recent years, usually by the predominantly straight, white, cisgender male population, to say, you know what, I'm going to ask this candidate a question, and if for whatever reason I don't like it or anything else about them, I'm just going to scream, not a culture fit, and then toss them out of the pipeline. So this has been fueling difficulties that we have in this space: racism, sexism, ageism, all these kinds of things. So values alignment is not culture fit. And it's not saying you have to fit into an exact mold here. We don't want you to be the exact Venn diagram overlap of who we already are. We want you to be in addition to who we are. But we also want you, and what's most important to you as a human, we want that to be largely, if not perfectly, largely aligned with the values of the company. And the classic example that I give of this is, listen, if you have a candidate come in who says, yeah, well, one of the most important things to me in life is the fact that I absolutely hate dogs. Okay, if they are applying for a company whose website is welovedogs.com, it doesn't matter if they're an amazing engineer with exactly the expertise that you need and they're willing to work within your salary band. They will be a bad fit. They will be unhappy. You'll be unhappy. So they should be evaluated out of the pipeline at this point. The values misalignment is the issue there. Okay. So that's bucket one, values alignment. Bucket two is emotional intelligence. When we talk about, we can get more into performance at another time, but basically there are two axes on which you judge anyone's performance. One is output, fingers on keyboard, what did we pay them to do? Okay. And then there's behavior, which is how do you act while you're doing the thing we paid you to do? Emotional intelligence is key to the output part as well, but especially key to the behavior part. If this is somebody who's going to be a jerk to everybody else in the company, if this is somebody who seems to be incapable of collaborating, of communicating well, of actively listening, of compromising when necessary, of any of these kinds of things, if they have low emotional intelligence, is basically what we're describing here, that would be a bad fit for the company, even if they have great values alignment and even if they seem to be the best engineer, the best artist, the best animator on the planet. So the second line of questioning, second bucket of questions, is going to have to do with emotional intelligence. And then the third bucket of questions is, can they do the job? Functional expertise. Do they have the skill? And that's when, if it's an engineer, then you give them a programming test. If it's an artist, you give them an art test, whatever. If it's a producer, you give them an Excel test. I don't know. But the point is, right, that's the third bucket. That's do you have the skills? Because you're here to meet a business need. If you have great values alignment and wonderful emotional intelligence, but you can't actually do the job, then we can't hire you. You're not meeting the business need. Okay. So we have three buckets. These are the things that you should be trying to learn more about when you are interviewing a candidate. And the way you try to get information in each of those categories should come from standardized questions that you have prepared in advance. When we are interviewing senior engineers, we should have a bank of 10 questions that we ever ask pertinent to emotional intelligence. We should have 5 questions about values alignment, whatever it is, so that over time, your interviewers can learn what good and bad answers look like. And you're not just making up questions on the fly. You can always drill down, like you ask them a question, they give you some sort of response, then you can drill into that to get details. Sure, fine, like not everything you ask has to be scripted word for word, but you should have standardized questions prepared so that you learn as an organization what good and bad answers look like. All right, so what have we been over here? We went through, please don't get sued. We went through evaluating versus filtering. We talked about 3 buckets, standardized questions, training your people. I'm a good judge of character does not cut it because there's actually phenomenally deep research that shows none of us are good at that, and we're all subject to unconscious bias. The research that Google has done in this space, which they have done on the backs of a number of academic studies, just goes to show, man, no, we're not good judges of character. Like we need data. So that's why we do the standardized questions and those sorts of things. So train your people. And then the last thing I'd say is if you're a smaller company or you're newer at this, get an applicant tracking system. Get a piece of software that is designed to help you move people through the stages of your pipeline. They submitted a resume, and now we're going to determine if they get an initial phone screen, and then we're going to determine if they get an initial call with the recruiter or whoever, and then we'll see if they talk to somebody on the team, or it's a panel, or they talk to the hiring manager, or whatever. And it automates things like, as soon as you apply, we send you an email thanking you for applying, so that we got the application. And then here's what I think is arguably the most important part, looking at it from the perspective of the job seeker. If this is somebody who we filter out, we evaluate out of the process at any stage, if you are using applicant tracking software, it is the easiest thing in the world to move them into a column where they automatically get an email. They know that they have been rejected. or that you're going to extend an offer, let's say, if you think they're a fantastic candidate. But point being, it is as frictionless as possible for you, the employer, to never ghost a candidate. Never leave them in limbo. That is what an applicant tracking system is there to do. So please get your hands on one. Please do that. And I have I have implemented one as a Google Sheet in the past, which is lousy at automating tasks, but at the very least lets you know exactly where all the candidates are, what stage in the pipeline. Oh, I'm moving them into this stage. I know I need to send them an email. These kinds of things, right? So at the very least, put it all in a spreadsheet, but preferably put it in an ATS so that you can automate all of the steps that a lot of companies, like the last time I was interviewing for a job, I submitted something like 80 some odd applications. About 10 of them got a response. Any response at all. That's absurdly bad for companies to never, ever tell you anything as a job seeker. Don't do that. Get an ATS. What was the question? Does anybody remember the question? So originally the question was, how do I get a job in games? Right? Which I said, heavens, why would you want one? And then said, okay, here's what you do when you're in an interview as a job seeker. And then said, okay, when you're the interviewer, here's what you do. All right, so we covered a bunch of stuff there. That was lengthy. All right. Next. So what would you say you do here exactly? Okay, that's actually for me. That's the question is really about, hey, what's a common gig look like for you, Keith? What's a standard engagement look like? You've tossed around leadership consultant. You've talked about cultural improvement, people operations. What's a standard gig look like? So I get that question occasionally. And so I thought I would toss that in here because it's going to have more meaning here in a moment for studios out there. I've said there's kind of a two-step process to answering this. And the first step is there really isn't a standard engagement. There are things that I have done more often than not, and there are ways that I approach situations, but every engagement, every client, every studio is slightly different. You're always dealing with slightly different people. If it could be cultural, right? You're dealing with a different country, different labor laws, different time zones. It could be everybody's co-located, everybody's remote. They've never been in the same room together. Like there are all different ways that each engagement can be different. But that's sort of the step one answer, right? Is that they're all different. But the step two of answering this question is, here's the most common thing that I have been tasked with doing for a client company. And this is across companies that are small, that are like startup-y, companies that are big and established AAA, whatever it is. The most common thing is manager training. And this harkens back, I can't remember if I said this in the previous office hours, but the number I will share with you, based on my experience doing manager training, being in a room in front of dozens of game developers and saying, hey, who here is currently a lead of some sort? And then a whole bunch of hands go up. And then I say, okay, put your hand down if you received any training before you were put in charge of leading other developers. And pretty much all the hands stay up. Like easily 80% of game dev leads that I have encountered started off leading others with no training as a manager whatsoever. Okay, so that's understandable then, perhaps, that the most commonly requested service I get is manager training. We've got a bunch of people here, maybe they are about to be leading others, or maybe they've been leading others for a while, and we've just never really had any common education around what are the skills you need to be doing this job well. So there's a bunch of stuff that I teach in that, and we can get into that again in the future if anybody asks. But for the companies out there, the point of consideration I will leave you with is this. Well, why is this the most commonly requested service? Okay, well, Keith kind of just said 80% of leads start their job as a manager with no training, no preparation. So then clearly there's a need in that regard. Yes, but those are all companies that have clearly been okay with their managers being unprepared. So then why would they bring me in now? Is there something else at play? And my contention is this. I have observed bits and pieces of this, and sort of I'm piecing something together behind the scenes that nobody says out loud. My contention is that when you speak with leadership at a company, and this isn't, usually there'll be somebody in maybe HR or people operations that are interested in things like training our managers, but they aren't the authority that's going to okay this. They aren't usually the authority that's going to write a check to bring in somebody like me. That's typically going to come from some sort of executive. This is going to come from a studio head, a CEO, usually. So the HR person may say, hey, I think this guy would be great because he's going to do X, Y, or Z for our company. But the CEO has to say, yeah, okay, you can do that. Are you going to pay him $5-6? Fine. I actually charge more than that. Don't think that's my going rate. But typically that's, I think, what's going on in the head of many studio leaders is what, how little money do we have to actually pay for something that's a very fuzzy, ambiguous category that doesn't yield an immediately visible ROI. Like, how does this affect my P&L that I'm going to train managers? I don't know. So please don't make it cost any more than necessary. So these people that are going to be okaying the process, I feel as though if somebody were to come in and say, hi, I'm a leadership consultant, and there are things that I can do for your company, there's an implicit commentary there that the company isn't perfect, and it's unlikely that an imperfect company is being led by a perfect leader. Right? So if you follow the chain of implications, it's if we have anything that this leadership consultant could do for us, that means I'm not a perfect leader. And whether that's a conscious decision or an unconscious decision on the parts of say, a studio head, I feel as though from things I've witnessed, from things that I've heard them say across the table from me, right, I feel as though that's a challenge to overcome in a lot of cases. Are you able as a leader, this is really the crux of it, are you able as a leader to recognize that it is important to do things like train your managers, any number of other things, have performance reviews that don't suck, train your interviewers, like all these kinds of things. Are you willing to recognize that steps like this are important enough that it's worth setting aside a measure of ego on your part to say, maybe there's something I could learn from this situation as well, even though I'm the top level decision maker at the company. So I'll throw that out there. All right, so what do you do here exactly, Keith? Well, the most common thing that I do is manager training. All right, what else we got? I'm kind of coming up on time here. I don't know that I need to be here more than an hour, but this one that I'm looking at here, so this is, speaking of CEOs, so this is an observation that I'll just share in the last couple of minutes here. I've not just done like manager training type things or helping with various people operations, reviews and interviewing, but I do one-on-one coaching as well. And there are a number of different reasons why you might employ a coach. You are a first-time manager, never done this before. Sure, totally makes sense that maybe you would have a coach who comes alongside and asks you questions and gets you to be a better you. Sure. But what if you have like a 15-year industry veteran CEO? Studio head founded the company 10 years ago. They've been doing this a while. This is not their first rodeo. What value does a coach represent for them? Well, I'll tell you. Specifically with CEOs, and I've seen this the most with comparatively smaller indie teams where I've been the coach to the CEO. What I have seen from them, like I go in and I want to help solve problems. I don't want them to think that I'm just skating my way through each call until I can send them an invoice for having done nothing. Like I want to help them solve problems. So that's what I'm thinking when I come into a coaching relationship for the first time. But I have learned, it seems to be very particular to CEOs, maybe of smaller companies. Sometimes the greatest value to folks like this is just to have somebody that they can talk to. Because man, you know what, if you're a lead, you probably have peers in the company, right? If you're an individual contributor, you're an IC, you're an animator, and there's a bevy of animators, whatever. You have, by virtue of your position in the company, in the org chart, you have a sense of community. When you're at the top of the org chart, less so. One CEO that I was talking with a little while back was lamenting the fact that they can no longer just come into a conversation and make a casual comment. Oh, you know what? That looks cool. Maybe with rounded corners. Like they can never just say that, because anytime someone hears that from the CEO, now it's, the CEO says it has to have rounded corners. And now they're off to go talk to the artists about putting rounded corners on everything. When you're CEO, you can't just make a casual comment anymore because you are the CEO. There's an absence of community at that point. And you may be on the best of terms with the leads or directors or producers or VPs or whoever reports to you as the studio head. Could well be the case. But there's still kind of a distancing that occurs because you're at the top of the org chart. And I feel like that probably drives a lot of people to have value in just, you know what, here's someone I can just talk to. I can vent, or I can feel like I'm screaming into a pillow for a while with this Keith guy, and he doesn't have any of the office baggage, right? There are no political ties there. I don't have to worry about him taking something the wrong way and then altering the course of our project because of it. Like none of that. I can just talk to somebody. A reason that I bring this up is because, and we can talk about burnout. Please send your questions about burnout because that's an important topic. And I'm not a licensed healthcare professional, but I have thoughts and I've done research and I have been a burned out dev. So I'm happy to talk about this stuff in the future. But one thing I can tell you from the research is we typically think of workload as the thing that drives burnout. It's too much to do, not enough time, right? Turns out there are actually 6 main factors that contribute to different degrees. Like these aren't all interconnected necessarily, but there are 6 factors. Workload is one of them, but it could be that you don't have any problems with workload and you still suffer burnout because of one or more of the other risk factors. One of those 6 factors is a sense of community or lack thereof. If you feel like you are alone, you're on an island, there's no one you can talk to, there's no one you can share a burden with, any of these kinds of things, that sense of isolation is a promoting factor in burnout. And I feel as though that's something we probably don't think about enough when we think of leaders in top-level positions, is that you have fewer peers, you have fewer connections, and if you're at the very top of that org chart, you are probably most susceptible to this sense of, I'm alone. And that is more likely to drive burnout. Now, we typically think of burnout as like we're the devs that are at the leaf nodes or at the edges of the org chart, right? We're the individual contributors. We're the most likely to suffer burnout. Yeah, that may well be the case. It can still happen to a CEO. And so for the CEOs out there, I would say, hey, think about this. Consider, what sort of a sense of community do you have? Do you feel a lack of community? Do you feel a sense of isolation? And what can you do about that so that you, the person at the top of the organization, don't succumb to burnout either? All right, so that's the mailbag we've got for now. Thanks for listening to the office hours here. There's some things that I mentioned, some resources there if you want to hit me up. Send me an email or connect with me in a future chat and say, hey, what about that thing that you said you could send? Happy to send you links to interview questions or my folder of book reports on leadership books. So thanks so much for your time, and we'll be here again next week.